Good morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council, and thank you for joining our program, Our Allies Aligned on Economic Statecraft, from a US and UK perspective on cooperation on Russia and beyond. My name is Kim Donovan, and I'm the director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative within the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council. Within the Geoeconomic Center, we focus on the intersection of finance, economics, and foreign policy. Our work in the Economic Statecraft Initiative includes the role of economic tools in addressing national security and illicit finance challenges. Last year, we saw unprecedented economic measures and multilateral sanctions taken to counter Russia's aggression in Ukraine and weaken Russia's ability to fund its war. Several of these actions were coordinated through the Group of Seven. This was a novel approach for aligning economic statecraft measures across multiple jurisdictions to maximize impact and demonstrate unity in condemnation of Putin's war in Ukraine. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Dileep Singh and Jonathan Black, former United States and United Kingdom Deputy National Security Advisors and former representatives for the heads of state for their respective governments to the G7. We will hear about their firsthand accounts on how coordination among the G7 worked within the Russia context and what we can learn and apply for economic statecraft in the future. So Dileep, Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
So Jonathan, if I can start with you. As we know, multilateral relationships are critical for coordination of economic measures. So how would you describe the state of transatlantic relations and more broadly G7 relations at the end of the Trump administration?
Well, Kim, first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's great to be here in the Atlantic Council and with my friend and great servant of his country, Dileep. It's a great question, and I would say this maybe, wouldn't I, here at the Atlantic Council, but the depth and the breadth of the transatlantic relationship transcends any administration, any prime minister, and any president. And I think we should hold that in our mind when we think about over the past few years, not least when we think about what we've done actually over the last year. That said, the G7 was not in a strong shape towards the end of 2020 and then into 2021 when we took up the presidency. I don't even think there'd been a summit actually in 2020. Of course, we'd had COVID, but there hadn't been a leaders' summit, which was the first time ever when, and that was under, as you referred to, in President Trump's when President Trump was in the chair. So for us, and maybe we'll come on to how successful we were, a really important part of our presidency was about trying to sort of re-establish the G7 as a forum for allied cooperation, and not just as major economies, but also as countries that shared a common set of values as well. And I think that came to be really important actually over the year that followed.
That makes a lot of sense, thank you. And then continuing with that, Dileep, at the outset of the Biden administration and in the run-up to the June 7 G7 summit that was hosted by the UK, what was the strategy in the White House to rebuild a sense of multilateralism?
Well, Kim, thanks for having me here. It's also a joy to be with Jonathan, one of the finest public servants from any country that I've ever worked with. And not because he was easy to deal with, but because he was a principled defender of the UK's interests, and he was a diplomat in the finest tradition. He listened, he tried to understand, and he found a way forward. In terms of multilateralism and our approach to it when we started the administration, I can simplify it by saying we wanted to do things we couldn't do alone and do things that mattered to people at the kitchen table. The president's words are still ringing in my ears. You've heard it many times. He says we're in an historical inflection point in which people are questioning whether democracies are too slow, too messy, too noisy to meet the great challenges of our time. And when we were approaching the G7 summit in Cornwall in 2021, of course, the greatest challenge was the pandemic. Millions of lives had already been lost. Climate change was burning hundreds of thousands of acres in our country and elsewhere. And we had really severe supply chain disruptions that were raising the cost of living to 4-decade highs. So the question was, could we come together on concrete deliverables that would jump off the page of a communique that most people ignore and that make people's lives better, safer, fairer? That was objective one. Objective two was speak to our counterparts in a way that made them understand that when we seek prosperity at home, it's mutually reinforced by prosperity abroad. Americans benefit when overseas markets are growing. We can sell more of our goods and services. Americans benefit when there's a security dividend, when the world is safe and stable. And people all over the world benefit when America is growing and invested in securing stability abroad. and when our innovations and investments spill over positively. So that was objective 2. But objective 3, I think, was the most fundamental, which is let's regain trust. And it kind of picks up on where Jonathan left off. The first test was showing up. I mean, the G7 leaders in Cornwall had not actually seen each other physically in the same room in over 2 years. And there was genuine warmth in the room when they gathered. And then the second element of building trust was let's actually do things together. Let's put some points on the board. That's how you build a sense of a relationship that can pay dividends later, and we'll come to that in the sanctions context.
That's great, thank you. And I mean, it does sound like the Cornwall G7 summit really was a consequential event. Is there anything more you'd like to elaborate on that, of what made it so important?
I think it's probably for others who weren't in the chair to comment on the summit itself. But I mean, just picking up on Dileep's point, as I said in my remarks, a bit of this was about trying to re-establish the G7 as a body that could do things, but a bit of it was also about trying to re-establish it as the basis for allied cooperation, and that was part of our insight at the start of 2021 in how we were trying to go about the presidency. Now, I do actually think that proved to be really useful in the year that followed, but none of us, of course, knew what was about to happen then. I think we had some things on our side as the chair. I mean, one was, and Dileep's referred to this, leaders had not met for a long time. So actually just the opportunity to come together in person was incredibly important. I mean, from the point of view of hosting a summit, trying to host a summit in a public health crisis is unbelievably challenging. I pay tribute to the people who had to organise and do that. But that sense of them coming together was really important. And then, of course, we had a new American administration that was committed to re-engaging in the multilateral process. And alongside the G7, we had COP26 under the UK's chairmanship that year as well. So we had some sort of, if you like, some tailwinds that helped us, both in terms of the desire, I think, for leaders to get together and the way in which the Americans wanted to re-engage. But as I say, I think it's probably for others to decide how successful the summit exactly was.
I'll brag a little bit about, I mean, this is a lot of the credit really does go to the UK, but we did drive the process towards what I was referring to earlier, concrete deliverables that people could understand.
Yeah.
And I would highlight 5 of them. One is we agreed as a G7 to give away 1 billion vaccines to the neediest countries with no strings attached. At the time, 1 billion vaccines was a big number. Second, we agreed to end a really damaging race to the bottom on corporate taxation. The estimates were that if we had a global minimum tax, we could raise $150 billion in global revenues that we could use to spend on R&D, infrastructure, childcare, education, broadband, clean drinking water, affordable housing. Those are words that mean something to people in each of our countries. 3, we agreed to reallocate $100 billion of SDRs to countries that were suffering the ravages of the pandemic and climate change. 4, we agreed to a new infrastructure partnership to offer an alternative to the Belt Road Initiative. And then we were clear about our values, not just what we're for, but what we won't tolerate. So we agreed to take a stand against importing products made with forced labor, and we agreed to end the international financing of coal. I think those were not just talking points; those were actually results that resonated.
Thank you. And so turning to Russia, which is really kind of where I think where the G7 has really demonstrated how they can come together on different issues. When did your respective governments begin to really consider that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine was coming? And how did that initial phase of Western deterrence or response planning take place? If maybe I could start with Dileep and then to Jonathan.
I think Jonathan would probably agree. National security is all about risk management. We're constantly obsessing about potential failures to imagine what could go wrong. But sometimes there's a risk that's just staring you in the face. And as I think back about how events unfolded in 2021, almost from the very start of the administration, it was clear that Putin had Ukraine at the very front of his mind. I mean, by April, you'll remember Russia was mounting forces at the border of Ukraine in ways that look like much more than just a demonstration. Those forces retreated going into and coming out of the Geneva summit between President Biden and Putin in June, which came right after the G7. But then in July, Putin dropped a rambling manifesto claiming, among other things, that Ukraine is not a real country. And then, of course, in September, that's when we began to see credible evidence of an even larger buildup of Russian forces on the border, and also this time, very detailed evidence of planning. Field hospitals, blood supplies, specific instructions to soldiers in terms of contingency plans. And so we made a decision, a tactical decision, to be transparent, to declassify as much as possible to our allies, but also to the broader public. We did that together. And that was really important, I think, for a few reasons. One is it took away the element of surprise for Putin. That had been a tactical signature of his going back decades, certainly in the case of the Crimea invasion. Two is it undercut his credibility. We knew that if he actually went forward with an invasion, it would probably be preceded by false flag operations, disinformation as pretext for the invasion. So this time there would be no confusion, and everyone would see this as a reckless, needless, catastrophic invasion of choice. And then three, it gave us leverage to start mobilizing our allies around a response across many dimensions: military, humanitarian, energy, and of course, economic and sanctions. And look, there were some who harbored doubts about whether Putin would follow through. I harbored doubts, many of us did, because it was such an irrational and catastrophic and self-defeating plan. But nevertheless, it at least allowed us to prepare for the worst. And that's what I think gave us the ability to start planning months before February 24.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and Dileep's the way Dileep's described the timeline is exactly the right one. When we published our integrated review, which is our sort of security and international strategy, we back in earlier in that year, we talked about Russia as an acute threat. So I think it was very clear from the start about what the UK's perception of Russia was, and we'd of course had lived through Salisbury and various other things, and that when we were very sort of clear-eyed about what the intention might be. And then, as Dileep said, you saw what might have been just exercise, but in one sense turned out to be a dry run in the spring in the borders of Ukraine. Then we benefit as two countries from extraordinary intelligence cooperation, and should pay tribute to the people who do that work, and therefore we benefit from being able to work together on those things, and that intelligence. I can't obviously go into too much of what it says, but that helped us with the planning that Dileep has talked about into the autumn of the year as well. And then as Dileep says, it's I think everyone in one sense harbored doubts about whether or not Putin would ever do this because of the sort of just the irrationality of it as you described. But it was also very clear, and it became increasingly clear about what the intent actually was as well.
And just to continue on with that, I mean, were there any specific, really hard discussions as, Western countries were starting to align on these issues and sharing information?
Sure. I think when you start thinking about preparing a sanctions program, especially one as severe as we were contemplating to meet the moment that we were fearing, you inevitably get into an accounting of who is bearing the most pain.
Yeah, exactly.
And so part of the planning involved first thinking about our strategic objectives for the sanctions, and we can talk about those. But then it was getting into our collective strengths and Russia's vulnerabilities. Where do those intersect? And following that kind of analysis, you can think about the kind of tools we would deploy. And that's where the accounting exercise becomes important, because once you've started to think concretely about tools you might deploy for particular scenarios, each of our respective countries begins to think about relative costs. And so we really did try, if we get into the specifics of the sanctions package, we tried to balance the channels of impact across capital, finance, but also the goods sector, energy, call it hunting oligarchs and their assets, and then also just networks and institutions, Russia's benefits and privileges that it used to enjoy. And what you'd find if you analyze the sanctions package carefully is we had tools that were being deployed across each of those channels, and it was deliberate and intentional to try to bring countries that might have been reluctant about their disproportionate burden to bring them on side.
Yeah, and to add to that, when you say sort of, was there anything that was hard about it? We began the sort of planning and thinking about this, well in advance because of the reasons that we've just talked about. I don't think at any point it was sort of hard in terms of it being a sort of a difficult conversation with allies. It was hard because, in one sense, this situation was unprecedented. We were thinking about the use of a set of economic tools in a context that we'd not done before. As Dilip says, there was an enormous amount of work that had to go on to understand just the dynamics of our economies with Russia, etc. So it was hard in a sense of it was just very hard policy contingency planning. It wasn't especially hard though in terms of it being a difficult set of conversations with our allies.
And so speaking of that, because the weekend of February 26th was pretty big. From a G7 standpoint, and really the most consequential weekend for sanctions implementation. How did that come together?
Maybe I'll start.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, by February 26, we knew tragically that this invasion was at the upper end of expectations. This was a large-scale invasion that was designed to seize multiple cities, including Kyiv. It was clear that it would involve tremendous human suffering. Tens of thousands of lives would be lost, hundreds of thousands of lives would be lost. And it was probably going to happen quickly if the Russians had their way. That was the backdrop. And on top of that, the emotional valence really began to pick up because we saw the images. Everyone, the whole world saw the images of schools getting bombed, maternity wards, hospitals. And we'd all heard firsthand or secondhand the sounds of President Zelensky, for example, telling European leaders, this might be the last time you hear me speak to you. And so that was the moment we were designing sanctions to counter. And we had, if you recall, on February 24, released an initial package of sanctions. We fully blocked Sberbank. We put correspondent bank sanctions on if we fully blocked VTB, we put correspondent bank sanctions on Sberbank. We had some oligarch sanctions, and we imposed debt and equity restrictions on 13 SOEs. Honestly, that felt inadequate by the 26th. And so the question that we were contemplating is, could we actually unleash the most powerful and potent sanction that we had in our arsenal, which was sanctioning Russia's central bank? Why would we do that? Well, one, it would surprise Putin in terms of the severity of the measure, the unity with which we might do it at once as over half of the global economy, and the speed within 48 hours of the initial invasion. So, surprise. Two is credibility. We had been saying months before the invasion, we are going to deploy the most severe sanctions in financial history if this invasion occurs. And, you should do what you say. Three is there was a moral argument. If we don't use this sanction now, then when would we? So that was the rationale. Now, in terms of how to actually get it done, that was hard within our systems and across our systems. Yeah. And I would say, Jonathan, I don't know if you would agree, we sort of worked this in concentric circles. I mean, I remember feeling there's nothing quite as powerful as a one-pager, a one-page G7 statement that summarizes how we are responding. And we drafted that, and then we worked really closely with Jonathan in the UK. Look, London and New York are the two financial centers of the world. So this central bank sanction made no sense if we weren't willing to do it together. And then, of course, the euro is also in the pantheon of reserve currencies. We needed to have Europe on board. And so we really worked hard on getting consensus first within the US, the UK, and Europe. And we allowed our European colleagues to work out some of their hesitations on their own before gathering as a group. And then, of course, Canada and Japan were also involved. But it was something we were negotiating and refining until 5 p.m. on Saturday, February 26th Eastern Time.
Which is quite a bit later in the day in European time. No, I would agree that, and Dilip's described what we did really well. I would just add a couple of things to it. I mean, the first one is about the psychology of the shock, and I can't overstate. I think that the shock that everyone, but particularly leaders in Europe, felt about seeing a full-scale military assault on another European country and an attempt to redraw Europe's boundaries through military force. We thought we'd left that behind. And interesting conversation to have about, did we foresee and, all of that. But when it happened, the shock for leaders was very intense. And therefore, we got a really strong political message and a political request from our leaders to really be ambitious on what the measures should be. And we had a G7 meeting, a virtual meeting on the Thursday or Wednesday, whenever it was, on the day of the invasion, that set up what we then did for the weekend. And that moral point that Dilip talked about, I think, is really important. In a different setting, Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General of the UN, talked about the role of sanctions between words on one hand and more on the other. And that was, I think that's a really important point. The other thing I would add was just about the innovation of the policy. I mean, it was an extraordinary policy intervention to make. I don't think I'd been involved in a degree of international coordination on an economic measure of this kind since the financial crisis 10 years before. So, and indeed, maybe even not then. And you are right to say that, in one sense, that weekend was the sort of high point of the intensity of the measures that we took. But we then actually sustained that on into the year, and maybe that's something that we'll want to come on to.
Yeah, and there were a lot of novel approaches from blocking and immobilizing central bank reserves, but then also the price cap for oil. I mean, how did that come about? I mean, that was pretty remarkable.
Do you want to start, John?
Well, I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I think it's worth touching on the price cap, because along with the central bank measure, they're probably the two most radical, I think probably is the word.
Yeah.
Right, the most radical measures that we took. And obviously the price cap came later. I can't remember exactly when it sort of started. It was one of those things that sort of began over time. And Dilip, come in a moment because you'll have your own recollections. But whereas we developed the central bank measure very intensively over a few days, the energy price cap took many weeks to develop. And Dilip's point about thinking about the different jurisdictions was absolutely critical in that respect. You had the UK as being the sort of global centre for insurance. You had the role that some of the European states had in terms of registering and licensing of vessels, the American role in terms of the financing. So it had to be a very, very coordinated effort, both across governments, but also with our industry as well. So it was a very, very intensive but long, intensive piece of policy making. But it's worth just, I think, stepping back on what we were trying to do with the price cap, because it's been much debated. The challenge for us as policymakers was that history can debate about European dependence on energy, but it was real, and I think the transition that European countries went through in terms of reducing that dependency is extraordinary. How quickly they did it over the course of last year, but it was an entirely right and relevant factor for us to have in mind. So we had to balance that with also obviously the need to try and balance Russian revenues, and that the counterfactual there was not what the oil price or Russian revenue, might have been had we not taken the sanctions measure we'd taken. The counterfactual was, what would the price have been if Russia had invaded Ukraine and we'd done nothing at all? And the price would have gone up enormously. And what we were trying to do with the price cap was find a way of navigating through, reducing down the opportunity for Russia to gain from its aggression, financially gain from its aggression. And we can then sort of debate the impact of the measure. But I think what's sort of interesting is whether directly through the cap or indirectly through its sort of signalling effect, we know that Russia is having to sell the oil that it is selling to other countries at a very, very significant discount. And in one sense, that was the intention.
I think Jonathan said it perfectly. My own recollection of when the discussions began go all the way back to the G20 Leaders Summit in Rome in October of 2021. Because as we started the initial planning and we started to think about where do we have asymmetric strength and where do we have asymmetric vulnerability, hard currency, cutting edge technology, clear advantages of the G7 relative to Russia. When it comes to fossil fuel energy, the asymmetry was flipped. And so we had to engage in a more nuanced strategy that had, I think, three parts to it. how do we minimize Putin's revenues from exporting energy, number one, while number two, maintain a steady global energy supply, and three, speed our transition to renewable sources. And that becomes really hard to do if each G7 country, which was 50% of Russia's customer base, imposes import bans, because you've reduced the quantity supplied to the global market, and the price premium that results from it might actually flatter Putin's export revenues and become self-defeating. So you need a price-based mechanism unless you can convince other suppliers to step up. That's why we released an unprecedented amount of reserves from our strategic petroleum, from our SPR and from the SPR equivalents in the IEA. But that wasn't sufficient by the summertime of 2022. And that was, to my mind, the context in which some of these creative mechanisms needed to be considered. And kudos to Jonathan and my successor and others for taking it to the finish line.
And we only have a few minutes left, but I did just want to get into kind of the conversation on lessons learned. I mean, this was a huge undertaking. Is there any advice that you have for if and when we have to do something like this again?
So I think here, Jonathan and I are actually going to be quite aligned. But so in my view, I am enormously proud of the unity that we, with which we acted within hours and days of the invasion. And we had almost 40 countries in our coalition, more than half the global economy, taking measures that had never been taken before. But the truth is, most countries did not join the sanctions regime, and many have sounded caution about it. So as I step back, I think about 4 lessons learned. Number one, I do think it's time to articulate at the highest levels of government a doctrine of economic statecraft. We've spent hundreds of years refining one for military engagement. We don't have one for the use of incredibly potent tools of economic statecraft: sanctions, export controls, tariffs, price caps, entity listings, and the like. A doctrine could lay down guiding principles that both constrain our use of those tools and prevent overuse, but also give comfort to third countries that we're not going to deploy these tools in a way that's arbitrary or capricious. Second, we really do need to bolster our collective analytical infrastructure to take inventory of all the tools that we have, ask the question, when do they work well? What are their limitations? What are their spillovers? What have we learned from history? And how can we use them alone or in tandem, unilaterally, multilaterally? And then three, I really think it's important for us to use these tools with balance. Sanctions and export controls, they are negative coercive devices. If you don't change behavior, we will cause you pain. That does not win hearts and minds. And so I think we have to pair the use of those tools with positive inducements like infrastructure finance, debt relief, bilateral aid, trade agreements that offer the prospect of mutual gain, not just unilateral pain.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and we spent time talking about this, so I definitely agree with what Dileep has had to say. I sort of add one thing to it into the point that Dileep's made at the end, because I talked before about the gap between war and words, and I think that's a very important gap, because that actually was the counterfactual that our leaders were faced with, and that's sort of relevant, I think, when people and we start reflecting on the effectiveness of the measures that we took. The conclusion I draw from it, though, is I do think economic statecraft is here to stay. And I also believe that carefully done, it can be an important tool alongside the rest of what we have in support of stability, of peace and prosperity as well. And I do think we need to think a bit about the role that they can play in response to economic coercion, but also what happens again when the fundamentals of the global order are challenged? What role then should economic policy play? Both because actually when the security order is challenged, the spillovers for the global economy and for the countries who can afford it least are very, very clear, as we found, and we should be absolutely clear about the impact of Putin's aggression on countries around the world that cannot afford it. But also because I think economic policy can play a role in the security space as well. But how we do that, capturing the point that Dileep's just said, that we had a remarkable alliance, but it's not one that is broad-based across the world, and it's certainly not one that's as large as the number of countries who are willing to condemn Russia's actions in the Security Council. Thinking about how we can build those sorts of mechanisms that command that broader base, I think is a really important exercise that we need to do.
Well, Jonathan, Dilip, thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Brilliant.
We are actually hosting our flagship conference, the Transatlantic Forum, in Berlin this September, where we plan to dive deeper into these issues of economic statecraft and some of the things that we raised today, and focusing on the EU side as well as the US perspectives. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to the Atlantic Council team for putting this together. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.